My name is Geraldine. I am 68 years old, and my occupation is a retired high school principal. My grown children loved to patronize me, completely convinced I was just some fragile burden, waiting desperately for their rare and rushed weekend visits. They treated my beautiful, historic home like it was their early inheritance, pacing the halls and just waiting for me to fade away into nothing. But let me tell you, that smug arrogance of theirs vanished into thin air the day they cracked open my safe, only to find it completely empty, right next to my one-way ticket out of their lives forever. It all started on a quiet Sunday evening. The sun was just setting over Atlanta, casting a warm golden glow through the tall windows of my home. I had poured my heart and soul into this house over the decades. It was my pride and my sanctuary. I was in the hallway, quietly tidying up the living room, gathering the scattered coffee cups and wiping down the mahogany tables. My son Jamal and his wife Chloe were visiting. They were sitting out on the back patio, enjoying the sweet tea I had just prepared for them. I walked toward the glass patio doors to ask if they wanted anything else to drink, but I stopped dead in my tracks. The door was cracked open just a few inches, and the evening breeze carried Chloe's voice right to me. Chloe is my white daughter-in-law. She has always walked through my doors with an air of superiority, acting as if she were doing me a huge favor just by breathing my air. I heard her let out an exasperated sigh and tell Jamal that she could not stand the smell of my liniment oil and the pile of antique junk taking up space. She whined, asking him when they were finally going to toss me into a nursing home so they could gut the living room and renovate it to her tastes. I waited for my son to defend me. I waited for Jamal, the boy I carried in my womb, the boy I sacrificed my youth for and worked double shifts to put through medical school to put his wife in her place. Instead, the words that came out of his mouth hit me like a physical blow. He chuckled a cold and calculating sound and told her to just be patient and wait a little longer. He casually stated that he was already having his lawyer draft up a certificate to declare that his mother was no longer mentally competent. My blood turned to absolute ice. The air was sucked right out of my lungs. I stood there paralyzed in my own home, the house I had scrubbed and polished for 40 years. My own son, my flesh and blood, was sitting on my patio furniture, drinking the tea I made, and calmly plotting to strip away my freedom and my human rights just to remodel a living room. I did not shed a single tear. The betrayal was too deep and too dark for tears. Instead, a chilling clarity washed over me. They thought I was a confused and helpless old woman they could easily throw away. They had no idea they had just awakened a sleeping giant. My late husband Thomas passed away when our children were just stepping into the most crucial years of their lives. A sudden heart attack took him from us on a rainy Tuesday morning, leaving a silence in our home that was absolutely deafening. I was left entirely alone to carry the heavy weight of the world on my shoulders. I did not just work a standard 9-to-5 job. Before I eventually climbed the ranks to become the principal of our local high school, I took on every extra administrative duty I could find. I tutored struggling students on weekends, organized community bake sales, and consulted for the school district during the grueling summer months. Every single dollar I earned had a specific purpose and a definite destination. I poured my literal life force into ensuring Jamal could walk through the doors of medical school without the crushing weight of student loans holding him back. I wanted my son to wear that white coat with absolute pride, knowing his mother had paved the way for his success. And when my daughter Tasha came to me with a bold dream of opening her own luxury beauty salon, I did not hesitate for a single second. I dipped deep into my hard-earned retirement savings and handed her the startup capital she needed to see her name shining brightly on a commercial storefront. I gave my children the universe, believing with all my heart that they understood the blood and massive sacrifice it took to hand it to them. I wanted my son and daughter to thrive, to never feel the bitter sting of lack that I knew so intimately growing up. I sacrificed my own comfort, wearing the same frayed winter coats for years and skipping vacations, just so my children could step out into the world looking like they truly belonged there. This beautiful historic house in Atlanta is not just a building made of bricks and mortar to me. It is a profound testament to our survival and our ultimate success. Thomas and I bought this property when folks like us had to fight tooth and nail just to get a basic mortgage approved in this neighborhood. We were one of the first black families on this street, and we faced blatant discrimination just to claim our piece of the American dream. We spent our weekends stripping old wallpaper, polishing the original mahogany trim, and planting the massive oak tree that now provides thick shade over the front yard. The original hardwood floors, the grand staircase, the sprawling backyard where Jamal and Tasha learned to ride their bikes. Every inch of this property is soaked in my sweat and my tears. It stands as a proud symbol of a black family upward mobility and triumph. It holds the echoes of our fervent family prayers, the rich smells of Sunday dinners, and the undeniable proof that we overcame every obstacle placed in our path. I preserved this house with every ounce of my strength, believing it would always remain a sacred sanctuary for our family. But the safe sanctuary I built began to feel entirely different once my children brought their spouses into the picture. Jamal married Chloe, and Tasha married Bradley. Both Chloe and Bradley are white Americans, and while I have always judged people strictly by the content of their character, these two brought a chilling breeze of entitlement right through my front door. They walked into my historic home, carrying an unspoken superiority complex, acting as though they were doing us a grand favor simply by joining our family. They treated my house like a museum they were forced to visit, and they treated me like the outdated curator who was overstaying her welcome. Chloe has this fake, tight-lipped smile she uses whenever I offer her food. I have spent decades perfecting my family recipes, passing down traditions that carry the deep history of our people. My collard greens, baked macaroni and cheese, and smothered chicken are legendary in our community. But Chloe would sit at my dining table, push the food around her plate with a fork, and let out loud, passive-aggressive sighs. She constantly complained about the smell of my traditional cooking, claiming the heavy spices lingered in her designer clothes and made my home feel suffocating. She would even bring her own bland, overpriced salads to our holiday dinners, completely disregarding the hours of love and physical labor I poured into cooking a feast for them. Bradley was cut from the exact same arrogant cloth, only he was louder and far more brazen about his disrespect. He loved to walk through my living room with his hands in his pockets, scrutinizing my antique furniture and the beautiful African art I had collected over the decades. He would make terrible, tasteless jokes about my outdated lifestyle, sneering at the very foundation of my home. He actually had the nerve to stand in my kitchen, lean against the counter I paid for with my own sweat, and tell me that my house looked like a dusty relic from a forgotten era. He laughed, while suggesting I needed to modernize my life, openly hinting that I should move into a small, sterile condo so they could flip my historic property for a massive profit. He spoke about my home as if I were already dead and buried. You have to understand exactly who I am to grasp the weight of this. I was a high school principal. I commanded absolute respect in auditoriums filled with hundreds of unruly students and demanding parents. I did not tolerate disrespect from anyone in my professional life. I could silence an entire gymnasium with just one stern look. Yet in my own home, I found myself biting my tongue until it practically bled. I swallowed my fierce pride every single time. Chloe wrinkled her nose at my cooking. I forced a polite smile when Bradley mocked the very house that provided the financial foundation for his wife's business. I swallowed my dignity because I loved my children fiercely. I convinced myself that keeping the family peace was far more important than addressing their blatant disrespect. I made excuses for my daughter-in-law and son-in-law. I told myself they just had different backgrounds and did not understand our rich culture or our painful history. I deliberately diminished my own bright light, just to keep the family intact, desperately hoping that my son and daughter would eventually step up and demand respect for their mother. I waited for Jamal to tell his wife to mind her manners in my home. I waited for Tasha to tell her husband to stop treating my house like a real estate investment. But they never did. My own flesh and blood simply sat back, sipped their wine, and let their arrogant spouses treat me like a useless burden, taking up valuable space. The disrespect did not happen all at once. It crept into my home like a slow-moving poison, disguising itself as concern before revealing its true venom. It started with small, seemingly innocent changes that chipped away at my peace and intentionally erased my presence in my own house. I would come back from my morning walk to find that the heavy mahogany side tables my late husband Thomas and I bought in the 70s had been pushed into the dusty garage. In their place stood flimsy, sterile glass tables that Chloe had ordered online without ever asking my permission. Then went the vibrant, woven throws my sister brought me from her travels to Ghana. Chloe claimed they clashed with the new modern aesthetic she was trying to create for my living space, as if my heritage was just an inconvenience to her decorating mood board. But the real knife to my chest came when I walked into the hallway one afternoon and noticed the blank, echoing spaces on the walls. The framed photographs of Thomas, the pictures of Jamal and Tasha in their graduation caps. The beautiful history of our black family, standing proud and tall through decades of struggle. All of it was gone. Every frame had represented a milestone we fought for. When I demanded to know where my memories went, Bradley casually pointed to a taped cardboard box shoved haphazardly near the back door. He had the absolute nerve to tell me the frames looked cluttered and dusty. He stood in my hallway drinking my coffee and said they were doing me a huge favor by clearing out the junk. I felt the heat rise in my neck, the familiar authority of a high school principal ready to discipline an unruly teenager. But before I could speak, Chloe chimed in with that sickly sweet, condescending tone. She touched my arm and said I was just confused. She looked at Jamal and sighed, saying I had actually agreed to the redecorating last week and just could not remember. She patted my hand and told me my memory was fading fast. They were gaslighting me right in my own sanctuary. They started treating me like an unpaid maid who was losing her mind. Tasha would leave her dirty dishes on the counter and tell me it was good exercise for my joints to scrub them clean. Bradley would intentionally hide my reading glasses or my car keys, and when I spent hours frantically searching for them, the four of them would exchange those knowing, pitiful glances. Jamal, my own flesh and blood. The boy I scrubbed floors to put through medical school would shake his head and mutter that I was becoming a danger to myself. They relentlessly pushed the narrative that I was incompetent. Every time I misplaced a pen, every time I paused to recall a name, Chloe was right there, whispering loudly to Tasha that I clearly needed a legal guardian. They orchestrated a relentless campaign of psychological warfare designed to strip away my confidence and make me doubt my own sanity. I had spent 45 years commanding respect, guiding young minds, and building a foundation of unshakable dignity. Yet here were these entitled strangers, aided by my own ungrateful children, treating me like a senile toddler who needed to be managed and controlled. I swallowed my pride. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted copper. I played the part of the confused, compliant old woman not because I was weak, but because a smart woman knows to observe her enemy quietly before making her final move. I let them think they were winning. The truth finally reared its ugly head on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Bradley had been lounging on my sofa all morning, typing furiously on his laptop and making hushed phone calls while I pretended to tend to my African violets in the kitchen. When he and Tasha finally left to run their errands, I walked over to the living room to straighten the cushions he had messed up. That is when I saw it. A thick manila folder had slipped down, deep between the cushions of the sofa. I pulled it out initially, intending to leave it on the kitchen counter for him, but the prominent logo on the front caught my eye. It was from a premium commercial real estate firm right here in Atlanta. My maternal intuition and my basic curiosity overpowered my polite restraint. I opened the folder and the air was instantly knocked right out of my lungs. Right there on top was a comprehensive, highly detailed appraisal of my historic home. The property my husband and I had purchased for practically nothing decades ago. The house we shed tears and sweat over was now valued at a staggering $1.5 million. But it was the documents stacked underneath the appraisal that made my blood run entirely cold. There were glossy brochures and printed applications for a state-run nursing facility located 3 hours outside the city limits. It was not a luxury retirement community with manicured gardens, lindens, and lively bingo nights. It was a notoriously underfunded, run-down institution that essentially warehoused elderly folks who had no money, no resources, and no advocates to check on them. I stared at the cheap, depressing pictures of the facility, feeling a wave of physical nausea wash over me. They were actively planning to lock me away in a place where people go to be forgotten and wait for death. My own children were plotting to throw me into a miserable facility just to get their greedy hands on my real estate. The grief was unbearable, tearing at my chest. But the sheer, unadulterated disrespect ignited a massive fire deep in my soul. I realized I needed undeniable proof. I could not just confront them with a folder they could easily snatch away and deny ever seeing. I needed to catch them in the act, hearing the words straight from their own mouths. The very next morning, while the house was empty, I drove across town to a specialty electronics store. I purchased a high-definition hidden camera, perfectly disguised as a digital alarm clock. I brought it home, placed it seamlessly on the mantel in the living room, and angled the lens to capture the entire seating area. It blended in completely with the minimalist decor Chloe was so obsessed with shoving down my throat. I connected the audio and video feed directly to a secure app on my smartphone. Then I set the bait. I told them I was going to visit an old sorority sister for the weekend, leaving the house entirely to them. Sitting in my quiet hotel room across town, I opened the app on my phone. The video feed was crystal clear. It did not take long for the rats to come out and play. On Saturday evening, the camera captured Jamal, Chloe, Tasha, and Bradley gathering in my living room. They were not just hanging out. They were aggressively celebrating. Bradley popped the cork on a bottle of expensive champagne, pouring it generously into my own crystal glasses. I watched in absolute horror as my children and their spouses clinked their glasses together, laughing and cheering in the house I had bled to pay for. They were toasting to my demise. They were celebrating the end of my independence as if it were a massive lottery win. Seeing Jamal smile broadly as Bradley mocked my antique furniture, seeing Tasha eagerly examining the real estate appraisal documents, it shattered the very last remaining illusions I had about my family. But it was the audio streaming from that hidden camera that truly revealed the darkest depths of their depravity. As they drank my champagne, their tongues loosened and the ugly, desperate truth spilled out into the open air. I turned the volume all the way up on my phone, pressing the speaker tightly to my ear. Jamal, the brilliant doctor I had sacrificed everything for, was pacing the hardwood floor in a sheer panic. He confessed to Bradley that his private medical practice was not nearly enough to cover the massive financial hole he had dug for himself. Jamal had been secretly investing heavily in cryptocurrency and highly volatile stocks, desperately trying to keep up with the wealthy, flashy lifestyle Chloe constantly demanded. He had lost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and his aggressive creditors were threatening to take everything, including his medical license. He was drowning in debt, completely ruined by his own arrogance and endless greed. Tasha was not doing any better. I heard my only daughter crying not out of guilt for what she was doing to her mother, but out of selfish frustration. She admitted that the luxury beauty salon I had funded with my retirement money was mere weeks away from filing for total bankruptcy. Bradley had completely mismanaged the finances, funneling the business profits into his own failed ventures and expensive personal habits. They were all standing on the edge of a massive financial cliff, and my house was the only parachute they could find to save themselves. Then Bradley spoke up, his voice dripping with venom and cold calculation. He leaned forward, setting his glass on my polished table, and laid out the entire sinister plot. He told them to stop panicking. He explicitly said that all they had to do was get the court to declare the old lady incompetent and legal control of all her assets would default right into their waiting hands. He mapped it out perfectly. They would force me into that cheap state-run facility, immediately put the historic house on the market for the full $1.5 million, and use the massive influx of cash to wipe out Jamal's crypto debts and save Tasha's failing salon. Bradley actually laughed out loud as he said it. He told my children that my life was basically over anyway, and it was time for them to cash in on their inheritance before the bank took everything they owned. They did not see me as a mother. They did not see me as a human being who had loved them, nurtured them, and protected them. They saw my life, my freedom, and my sanity as nothing more than a convenient tool to liquidate their debts. They were entirely willing to sacrifice my remaining years on this earth, locking me in a miserable facility just so they could continue driving luxury cars and pretending to be successful in front of their friends. As I listened to my own son and daughter eagerly agree to this monstrous plan, a profound shift happened inside of me. The weeping, heartbroken mother, who had mourned the loss of her family, completely vanished. The tears dried up instantly, leaving behind a cold, hardened, and ruthless resolve. They thought I was a weak, forgetful woman who would simply lay down and let them orchestrate her destruction. They forgot that I survived decades in a world that tried to break me. They forgot the sheer strength it took to build this legacy from the ground up. They were about to learn the hard way that this black mother was not a stepping stone for their pathetic failures. I was going to burn their arrogant plans straight to the ground. I sat on the edge of my bed, holding my phone. The voices of my children and their spouses, plotting my absolute downfall, echoed in the quiet space of my hotel room. I did not shed a single tear, not one. For 40 years I had watered the soil of their lives with my sweat, my prayers, and my love. But in that horrifying moment, every drop of maternal softness I possessed evaporated into a cold, hard, and ruthless resolve. I was a black woman who had survived the bitter sting of segregation, fought my way to the top of the public education system, and buried the love of my life with dignity. I was certainly not about to be discarded by two spoiled, ungrateful brats and their arrogant spouses. I walked over to my hotel closet and pulled out my sharpest navy blue suit. It was the exact suit I used to wear when I had to face down a hostile school board. I pinned my hair back meticulously, applied my favorite deep red lipstick, and grabbed my heavy leather handbag. I did not look like a confused, fragile old woman. I looked like a woman preparing for absolute war. I drove straight to the downtown luxury offices of Harrison and Associates. Mr. Harrison was not just a powerful, highly connected corporate attorney. He was one of my late husband Thomas's oldest and most trusted friends. We had shared decades of Thanksgiving dinners and celebrated countless family milestones together. When I walked into his sprawling corner office overlooking the busy Atlanta skyline, he greeted me with a warm, familiar smile that quickly faded the second he saw the raw steel in my eyes. I sat down across his heavy mahogany desk, pulled out my smartphone, and played the video from the hidden camera. Mr. Harrison sat perfectly still, listening in absolute silence as the recording captured Bradley and Chloe laughing about stripping my assets, while Jamal and Tasha eagerly agreed to lock their own mother away in a state-run facility just to cover their massive, shameful debts. I watched Mr. Harrison's face turn a deep shade of red with a quiet, terrifying fury. He slowly took off his reading glasses and looked at me with profound sadness. But I immediately raised my hand to stop his pity. I told him in a voice as hard as stone that I did not come to his office for a shoulder to cry on. I told him I came here to build an impenetrable legal fortress. We spent the next 3 hours drafting a flawless master plan. I instructed Mr. Harrison to arrange immediate priority appointments with 3 of the most highly respected geriatric psychiatrists in the state of Georgia. I wanted independent, comprehensive, and grueling evaluations of my mental acuity. I needed an airtight medical record, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that my mind was as sharp and capable as it had ever been. Mr. Harrison completely agreed, noting that having 3 separate sworn medical affidavits from top-tier professionals would instantly destroy any fraudulent claims my children might try to present in a courtroom. By the time I left his elegant office, my legal shield was firmly in motion, but the financial trap still needed to be set, and I knew exactly how to spring it. When I finally returned to my historic home, the house was quiet again, but it no longer felt like a sanctuary of memories. It felt like a strategic battlefield. I walked directly into Thomas's old study, locked the heavy double oak doors behind me, and approached the large oil painting of the Georgia marshlands hanging on the far wall. I swung the heavy frame aside to reveal the thick steel dial of our hidden wall safe. Thomas had always been a man who believed in keeping a tangible safety net for his family. He never completely trusted the banking system to hold all our security. Over the decades, through quiet diligence and smart decisions, he had accumulated a substantial private reserve. My children knew the safe existed, but they arrogantly assumed it held a few old savings bonds and perhaps some spare emergency cash. They had absolutely no idea of the true magnitude of what was resting inside. I spun the dial, entering the date of our wedding anniversary, and pulled the heavy steel door open. Inside, resting neatly on the velvet-lined shelves, were heavy stacks of solid gold bars, thick banded bundles of $100 bills, and high-yield municipal bonds that had been maturing silently for over 20 years. This was the wealth my children believed they were inherently entitled to. This was the secret treasure they were willing to sell my freedom and my sanity to obtain. Over the next 2 weeks, I moved through the city like a ghost. With the highly discreet help of Mr. Harrison and a specialized wealth management firm, I completely emptied that safe. We quietly liquidated the physical gold and the bonds, and I transferred every single penny of that immense wealth into a highly secure blind trust located in an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The trust was entirely legal, completely untraceable to anyone without my direct explicit authorization, and absolutely unreachable by any domestic court order or power of attorney. My children might try to file, but I did not stop with the safe. The house itself was their ultimate prize. It was the $1.5 million golden ticket they planned to use to wipe out Jamal's crypto debts and save Tasha's failing salon. So I pulled the rug right out from under their greedy feet. I sold the property to a private real estate investment group based out of New York. However, Mr. Harrison negotiated a very specific, unshakable condition in the sale contract. We implemented a life estate clause. This brilliant legal maneuver meant that while the investment group legally owned the deed and the property itself, I retained the absolute irrevocable right to live in the home, exercise total control over the premises, and remain there until the exact day I voluntarily decided to leave or passed away. The massive cash payout from the sale of the house was instantly wired directly into my offshore trust. I was sitting in my beautiful living room completely stripped of domestic assets on paper, yet I was wealthier and more legally secure than I had ever been in my entire life. I did not have to wait very long for the vultures to make their final desperate move. Exactly 3 weeks after I emptied the safe and sold the house right out from under them, The betrayal finally arrived at my front door. It was a crisp Saturday morning. I was sitting calmly in my favorite armchair, sipping a cup of black coffee, when a loud, aggressive knock echoed through the hallway. Before I could even stand up, the front door swung open. Jamal had used his spare key. He walked into the living room, sweating profusely, rubbing the back of his neck, and completely refusing to make eye contact with me. Right behind him was Tasha, clutching her designer purse tightly and looking around my home like she was already measuring the spaces to see what she could sell. Then came Chloe and Bradley, walking side by side with that familiar, sickening swagger of white entitlement. But they were not alone. Trailing behind my family was a man in a cheap, wrinkled grey suit, holding a scuffed leather briefcase. He had the shifty, nervous energy of a lawyer who handled shady deals in back alleys and took cash under the table. I remained seated, maintaining my absolute composure, as I slowly placed my coffee mug on the coaster. Jamal cleared his throat, trying desperately to put on his best, most comforting doctor persona, but his voice trembled with pathetic cowardice. He told me that the family had been noticing a severe and rapid decline in my memory and my overall health. He actually had the nerve to look his own mother in the face and say that for my own safety and well-being, they had made the difficult medical decision to transition me into a full-time care facility. Tasha chimed in right on cue, pulling a tissue from her purse to dab at fake non-existent tears. She dramatically stated that a doctor agreed my condition was worsening rapidly, and it was simply too dangerous for me to be left alone in such a large, demanding house. The man in the grey suit stepped forward, pulling a thick stack of legal documents from his briefcase. He introduced himself as their attorney and placed a medical power of attorney form heavily on my coffee table. He said it would be much easier and less painful for everyone involved if I just signed the paperwork, voluntarily transferring full control of my medical and financial decisions over to my son. I looked down at the papers, and then I looked up directly at Chloe. She could not hide her smug, victorious satisfaction. She crossed her arms, stepped right into my personal space, and dropped the sweet, concerned daughter-in-law act completely. Her voice was harsh, cold, and commanding. She told me to just sign the papers and stop making things so difficult for everyone. She boldly stated that they had already secured a bed for me at a state facility, and that a moving truck would be here by next weekend to clear out my junk. Bradley leaned against the fireplace, smirking down at me, as if he had just won a grand prize. He arrogantly added that if I stubbornly refused to sign the documents, the family would have absolutely no choice but to take the matter to a judge and have me forcibly removed by a court order. He cruelly stated that no judge in the world was going to believe a confused, declining old woman over a respected medical doctor like Jamal. They stood around my chair, a united, impenetrable front of greed and malice, boxing me in with their threats and ultimatums. They truly believed they had me trapped in a corner with no money, no power, and no way out. They thought I was terrified into submission. They had absolutely no idea I was just sitting there waiting for the perfect moment to drop the match on the gasoline they had poured all over their own lives. Sunday morning arrived with a crisp, deceivingly peaceful breeze settling over Atlanta. I was sitting in my favorite velvet armchair in the center of the living room, calmly sipping a hot cup of dark roast coffee. I was dressed impeccably in a tailored emerald green suit, my hair perfectly styled, wearing the pearls my late husband gave me. I looked nothing like the broken, defeated old woman they expected to find. Exactly at 9 o'clock, the heavy oak front door swung open. Jamal, Chloe, Tasha, and Bradley marched right into my home, carrying thick cardboard moving boxes and rolls of packing tape. They moved with a sickening, cheerful energy, as if they were arriving for a neighborhood picnic rather than the forced eviction of their own mother. Bradley dropped a heavy stack of flattened boxes onto my pristine hardwood floor with a loud, disrespectful thud. He shoved his hands into his pockets, puffed out his chest, and looked down at me with that arrogant smirk I had grown to despise. He told me I needed to get up out of that chair and start gathering my clothes immediately. He haughtily announced that the transport van from the state nursing facility would be arriving in a few hours, and they did not have all day to deal with my confusion. Chloe chimed in, rolling her eyes and telling me to make it easy on everyone so they could start pulling up the carpets by the afternoon. I did not shed a single tear. The searing pain of their betrayal had completely burned away any lingering softness or maternal mercy in my soul. I took one last slow sip of my coffee, placed the mug gently on the glass coaster, and offered them a chillingly calm smile. I reached into the pocket of my blazer, pulled out a small silver USB drive, and tossed it right onto the center of the coffee table. It landed with a sharp clatter that echoed in the sudden silence of the room. I looked Bradley dead in the eyes and repeated his exact words, verbatim. I told him that I heard his brilliant plan to have a judge declare the old lady incompetent, so the legal control of her assets would default right into his waiting hands. I turned my sharp gaze to Jamal and Tasha, quoting their exact, sickening agreements to liquidate the house to pay off massive crypto debts and a failing beauty salon. I told Chloe that her brilliant idea to lock me in a miserable state-run facility to save her luxury cars was thoroughly recorded in high-definition video and crystal-clear audio. The absolute silence that crashed down on that living room was deafening. Their arrogant, entitled smirks melted instantly, replaced by a pure, unadulterated panic that made them look like terrified children caught in a deadly trap. Jamal took a shaky step forward, his face draining of all color until he looked like a ghost. He raised his trembling hands desperately, trying to construct a pathetic lie. He stammered that I had taken their words completely out of context, that they were only brainstorming worst-case scenarios for my own medical protection, and that I was deeply misunderstanding their intentions. I stood up slowly, commanding the space with every ounce of authority I possessed. I sharply raised my hand, silencing his cowardly excuses instantly. I told him to save his breath, because the performance was officially over. I turned my back to them and walked purposefully toward the large oil painting of the Georgia marshlands hanging on the far wall of the library space. I grabbed the heavy gold frame and swung it aside, revealing the thick steel dial of the hidden wall safe they had been drooling over for months. I punched in the combination with swift, precise movements and pulled the heavy door wide open. Tasha gasped, instinctively stepping forward, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation of seeing stacks of gold bars and bundled cash. Instead, she stared into a dark, hollow, and entirely empty steel box. I pointed to the desolate space inside. I asked them if this was the grand treasure they were willing to sell my soul to obtain. I told them there was not a single penny left, not a single ounce of gold, not one solitary bond. As they stood there, paralyzed in shock, the front doorbell rang a sharp, commanding tone. The door opened, and in walked Mr. Harrison, my powerful attorney, accompanied by a sharp-looking man in a tailored suit, representing a prominent New York real estate investment group. Mr. Harrison did not even bother to greet my children. He opened his leather briefcase, pulled out a stack of heavily stamped legal documents, and dropped them right next to the USB drive. He looked at Jamal and Bradley with absolute professional disdain. He announced in a booming voice that the house they were standing in had been legally and permanently sold over a month ago. He explained that the fraudulent medical power of attorney they were clutching in their sweaty hands was entirely worthless legal trash. I had established a life estate clause, and since I was now voluntarily vacating the premises today, the new corporate owners were taking immediate and full possession of the property. I stepped forward, closing the distance between myself and the 4 people who had conspired to destroy me. I looked straight into the terrified eyes of the traitors I once called family. I told them I knew every single dirty detail about their financial ruin. I exposed Jamal's reckless cryptocurrency gambling that had left him drowning in aggressive creditor threats. I called out Tasha and Bradley's completely bankrupt salon, completely ruined by their own sheer incompetence and foolish spending. I let my voice drop to a cold, razor-sharp whisper. I told them they actually thought they could sell their own mother to the lowest bidder just to clear their pathetic failures. I told them to go out into the world and pay their own debts because the bank of their mother was permanently closed. I looked at Jamal and Tasha one last time and declared that as of this exact moment, I no longer had any children. The reality of their absolute destruction finally crashed down upon them with the weight of a collapsing building. Tasha's legs completely gave out. She dropped heavily to her knees on the hardwood floor, burying her face in her hands and weeping with loud, ugly, desperate sobs. Jamal lunged forward and falling to his knees right beside her, tears streaming down his face as he reached out to grab the hem of my jacket. He pleaded with me, sobbing uncontrollably, begging his mother not to do this to them, crying that they would lose absolutely everything they owned and face total ruin. Chloe and Bradley were backed against the wall, their faces twisted in sheer, unadulterated terror as the real estate representative firmly instructed them that they were now trespassing on private corporate property. I looked down at them, and I felt nothing. No pity, no hesitation, no remorse. The maternal bond they had relied on to abuse me had been completely severed by their own treacherous hands. I calmly stepped back, pulling my jacket away from Jamal's desperate grasp. I walked over to the hallway closet and pulled out my sleek designer leather suitcase, which I had meticulously packed days in advance. I unzipped the front pocket and slowly pulled out a crisp first-class one-way boarding pass. I held it up so they could clearly read the destination. I told them I was flying out to a luxury beachfront resort in Costa Rica, where my offshore trust had already purchased a gorgeous villa overlooking the ocean. I told them I was going to spend the rest of my days drinking fresh fruit juice in the warm sunshine, living a life of absolute freedom, completely unbothered by whatever miserable fate awaited them here. I gripped the handle of my suitcase, standing tall and unbroken. I looked back at them one final time and said my last words. Goodbye. The new property owners have a professional clean-out crew arriving in exactly 30 minutes to remove any remaining trash from these premises, so I highly suggest you start walking. I turned around and walked out the front door into the bright, beautiful morning sun. I stepped into the waiting black luxury sedan, leaving behind 4 ruined people, frozen in the devastating despair they had built with their own 2 hands. To every mother and every woman listening to my story today, I want you to hear my words clearly. We are taught that a mother's love means endless sacrifice and boundless forgiveness. But true love does not mean allowing yourself to become a doormat for the insatiable greed of others. Do not ever hand over the keys to your life, your hard-earned wealth, or your precious peace of mind to anyone, not even your own flesh and blood. You spent decades building your foundation, so you must protect it with fierce determination. True family is built on a foundation of mutual loyalty, not financial convenience. Respect must always be met with respect, and those who treat you like a burden do not deserve to inherit your blessings. I lost 2 ungrateful children, but I finally found the absolute freedom and the deep respect that I truly deserved all along. Now I have to ask all of you watching out there today, if you were in my exact situation, how would you have handled those deeply ungrateful children and their entitled spouses? Would you have done what I did, or would you have chosen a completely different path? Please share your thoughts and let me know down in the comments below, because I read every single one. Also, please tell me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is over there right now. I always love seeing how far my story has traveled. If my journey resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on these gritty and incredibly real life stories. Thank you so much for your sweet support. and for spending your precious time with me today. Goodbye, and I will see you next time.